I think, obviously, as technical leaders, you understand the value of measurement. The last time I gave a talk like this, it was to probably a high contingent of junior developers who struggle to connect what they're doing on a daily basis to things that matter and why they should do things certain ways, or keep track of things in specific contexts. But I honestly think that, I've come by measurements the hard way. I hated being measured. I hated keeping track of things. It doesn't come naturally to me. But at the same time, I've always, as a result of shying away from metrics and measurement, to understand whether I'm moving in the right direction, whether I'm making progress, whether I'm wasting time, whether I'm stuck, whether I can actually prove the things that I think, or scale things that I'm doing. So I think that it's really important to have clarity around what we measure, how we measure it, why we're measuring it. And ultimately, I think as technical leaders, as a CTO, I always really struggled to kind of justify my investments, my decisions, my team's contributions, my strategy to the board, to my peers. And I think that measurement really made that easier when it was something that I could clearly demonstrate and clearly connect my efforts to in terms of results. So hopefully I don't have to convince you that measurement is valuable, but a couple of ways that I think it is really helpful is it really allows us to kind of focus on, out of all the things that we could be distracted by, all the things that could overload us, on a select few things that we can drive a lot of alignment around, right? So as a group, we can all aim at the same target, or we can all work to move a number in the right direction, or show meaningful progress. And it's not always quantifiable, as you know, it's always qualifiable as well. But I think that it's very important as leaders to be able to kind of justify, support, and rationalize the decisions that we make, the strategies we have, the plans that we have, our roadmaps, and the things that we believe to be true. And I think that as we aim to mature as leaders, we have to be able to instill that diligence and that rigor all the way through the organization, all the way down to the junior developers, or people who are outside of our context, who don't necessarily understand why we're making the decisions that we're making. So a couple of things that I think I want to talk about first, like problems that I see with measurement in a lot of different contexts. Who here has heard of or played the game Roller Coaster Tycoon? Anybody? All right. You might be familiar with this metric of park happiness. For anyone who hasn't played the game, park happiness is kind of like the golden metric. It's the metric that you want to optimize for, right? You want people who are happy to be patrons of your theme park. And so this actually got represented in a very, very simple ratio. It's the ratio of happy people to unhappy people. So what does that mean when you're playing the game? Obviously, you pick up the unhappy people and you drop them in a lake and kill them, because then you have fewer unhappy people and your park happiness ratio goes through the roof, right? This is exactly what we do not want in our organizations, right? Gameable metrics, proxy metrics, metrics that don't actually represent what we're trying to achieve. And yet, this is so seductive and common, right? We run into these challenges all the time where it's easy to measure something that's very readily available. There's a simple way of measuring it, so that's what we gravitate towards. So some of these things that show up all the time, how many people have heard of watermelon metrics? Like it's green until the last moment, until you actually have to reconcile with the metrics and you realize that it's all red on the inside. So it looks green on the outside, but it's really red through and through. Another thing that we often see is like people essentially representing the metrics as a proxy for what they've actually contributed, right? It can be easy to hold up a metric that we've done everything that we can to maximize, while in reality, it's not representative of sustainable trends or progress, right? Another one we often see is distance. Like this is one I struggle with all the time. How can I connect what I'm doing today to something that I expect to be true in the future, right? And this can be time horizon, but it can also be proximity based, right? across teams, I'm collaborating with other groups. How do I make sure that we're all pulling in the same direction to move our key metrics in the right direction? Other ones, I think that substitutions or proxies of metrics for things that are harder to measure is a chronic issue that I see all the time. Obviously, we have measurements and metrics from all over the place now. Everybody could be drowning in measurement if we wanted to, or if we're not careful. So we also really have to manage the load of metrics that we're trying to pay attention to and focus on the highest priority, highest impact metrics. And this is a real challenge. And then, of course, it's very easy to measure ourselves. How many people have played a racing game where you're in second place and your job is so easy because you just have to follow the line of the leader and wait for your chance to get out in front? But then when the moment you're in front, you're like, oh no, now I have a million decisions to make, right? It's so easy to follow an example. It's so easy to work by comparison rather than pick a hypothesis, chase it, and have kind of the rigor and the diligence to really know that our numbers are doing what we expect them to do. And then I think that breadth is a big problem. It's so easy to focus on things that are readily available to us or over-index on one or two metrics when we really work in complex systems that are changing all the time with seasonality and all kinds of other factors. So this is not an easy job, but I think there are a couple things that I often find missing in organizations that are really struggling to measure or create a culture of measurement. One of the things I think that's often missing is this idea of working backwards. What are we trying to achieve in the future? What is the future that we're trying to make reality? And then working backwards to today. What is going to be the next step that moves us in a direction that we can demonstrably show is going to get us there, or likely to get us there? Another one I think is really common is this idea that we're missing just the simple practice of saying, I'm going to set a target and I'm going to understand my baseline and then measure the gap and narrow the gap between where I am and where I want to be. Cybernetics, if anyone's ever heard of cybernetics, is basically the study of this, setting a target and eliminating the gap between the current state and the future state. There's a lot of science that we could pay attention to, but essentially, sometimes it just feels overly complicated and we just pick a metric, put it on a dashboard, and make sure that it doesn't go in the wrong direction for too long, right? I think that it can also be a challenge, and we have OKRs, luckily, to contribute to this, but also OKRs are really challenging. This idea of picking a target and then reverse engineering that down to the leading metrics. And I'll talk a little bit more about leading and lagging metrics, but essentially, how do we know at the micro scale whether a contribution is having a positive impact at the macro scale or at the long time horizon? And usually we have to literally connect the dots from top to bottom to do that. This idea that we work in complex adaptive systems, there's people involved, there's emotions, there's outside influences, there's a lot going on. And I think that sometimes we can just brute force that scenario and pick a metric and narrowly focus on that, and that can be effective, but it's also very brittle, right? It's not a very resilient approach. So it can be very effective and efficient in some scenarios, but also it can't be something that we rely on because it's not really that flexible. I think it's important when you have a measure to have somebody who's saying, I will drive that in the right direction, I will lead it, I will be the person who can report on it, who can tell you where it is and where it's going. Ideally, that person has a backup, but I find in a lot of scenarios we have everybody owns it, which means nobody does, and it falls through the cracks, and there's fingers pointing everywhere. And then the last one, I think, is this idea of having too many things in flight, too many measurements that aren't connected together, that we're trying to reconcile at all times, and a lack of focus. So I'll talk a really, really quick scenario. I was brought into a company who is basically trying to establish a case for automating deployment because they were dead set that this is what everyone's doing. Dora says to do it. All of IT Revolution says to do it, and we don't have it. And it turns out that they had the foresight to basically trace and map out their entire development process. And as a result of actually digging into this assumption and trying to validate it with data, because we had to prove this investment to a board. We found that not only did the data reveal that we had different candidates for a higher impact investment of automation, but that that would have saved us millions of dollars heading in the wrong direction, right? Having data, having validation, having evidence can be the difference between wasting time and having to redo tons of work or losing a huge advantage in the market. So I think being able to put our measurements in the context of our system of work is really helpful. There's not a lot of people do this on a regular basis, and I think that it's extremely effective to basically attribute our measurement to things that are tangible in the real world that we know are having a negative impact on getting things done. So when we talk about this idea of what matters the most, obviously this is highly subjective, right? The question to you is, what are you trying to understand? What is the question you're trying to answer? And that is a different question for everybody in your organization. It might be a different perspective. It might be for a different reason. It might be because they have a specific specialty. It could be the same measurement, but they're going to make a different decision based on what they see happen to that data. So I think that when we talk about what is good, there's a couple of criteria that I think are really important. There's obviously efficiency. We want to understand that we're not wasting time, wasting effort, wasting investment. We have to make sure that we're hitting the right target, not just being precise, but being accurate. And I think that to go along with that, we have to understand with a degree of confidence that what we're investing in is actually paying off, and that if we invest in the future, we are likely to not waste that investment. Okay, so from my perspective, my company's Flow, specifically visible flow, I specialize in getting more things done. That's why people call me, because they can't get out of their own way, or they just see a mountain of work and things are not headed in the right direction, or not fast enough. But I think it's very important to qualify this and think about what are the right things to get done, right? Especially now that we have generative AI, it's easier to do things, but all that noise could be having a negative impact on doing the right things and making sure that the right things are getting done. So there's a couple of ways that people might be familiar with. I'll really quickly go through these. You can get my slides afterwards. But kind of on the older end of the spectrum of developer productivity, engineering, performance, we have the Flow framework. There's a lot to this. Essentially, we're talking about leading and lagging metrics for throughput. That's the name of the game. Dora kind of qualified this, more focusing on the inner loop and thinking backwards from financial impacts of specific engineering practices, which is helpful. But again, mostly lagging metrics, mostly looking at survivorship bias of high-performing organizations, and then doing a lot of correlation down to individual practices. Really valuable, but can't be the sum of everything that you measure as an engineering leader. Space came out a little bit later, adds kind of like developer experience to the landscape. And then we had the DX Core 4, which is one of the more recent frameworks for measuring developer engagement and developer experience. Obviously, now we have agentic aspects to this and thinking about agent experience. But really what happens when you over-rotate or focus on one of these frameworks, you have gaps in your ability to visibly understand your system of work as a whole. And you may struggle to really connect outcomes to leading metrics, output, contributions. So you really still need to zoom out and think about this entire ecosystem of getting things done and how you understand what the contributions are actually providing to you in terms of results. Another way to do so Gartner did this exhaustive research study of a lot of different metrics. There's some of these I want to call out. So you'll notice the technical metrics. A lot of these technical metrics we all understand are very poor indicators of performance, but things that we probably should measure and make sure that they're not headed in the wrong direction. But what I really like here is product metrics, like we're talking more about things getting done. And then also, all of this really matters in the context of business and business outcomes. So I think really understanding your landscape in terms of these metrics and more, and how all of them connect together is necessary as a technical leader. Obviously, you don't need to chase all of this all at once, but this is what I think good looks like. And in bold are the ones that I think are really consequential, and I'll talk more about a couple of them. But if we think about DORA metrics in particular, how many people are tracking DORA metrics right now? Okay. The challenge with DORA metrics is they kind of exist downstream of a lot of activities in product and vision and strategy and portfolio. And they're also upstream of a lot of things like actual release to customers and customer activity and customer engagement and business results. So I think it's really important to put them in the context of a more holistic system of flow. If we think about two of these that focus on getting things done or actual delivery, they really represent just a piece of this overall flow of activity. And when we think about the more complete representation, there's gaps as a result of that. You know, we have lead time is this fully expansive calculation of if you want to do something, how long does it take for it to actually get to your customers so that they can actually use it, and you get real feedback on how that's going. That's super important. So we have to be really putting all these metrics in the context of what are they for, what are they indicators of, are they telling us the full story, or enough of the full story? And if we think about customers, I really am a big fan of this idea of working backwards. If we have customers, we really don't know what to measure until we understand what do they need, what are they asking us for, and trace that all the way back to the activities that are happening in our environment that give us an indication of, are the things that we're doing likely to lead to the positive outcomes that we aim to achieve? Okay, I want to talk about a little bit of a framework that I like to use to kind of put this in context of a big picture without losing clarity on the granular detail. So we all know inner loop, middle loop, outer loop. I think that having conversations in terms of these various levels of detail is really important, because it's how I create this big picture of a more holistic system of work without losing people, right? Because we can kind of segment and modularize these things and say, let's talk about the inner loop, let's zoom out, let's talk about the outer loop. So you think about these leading indicators in the inner loop, these activities that we think are going to move us in the right direction, have to be connected to middle loop activities, and then ultimately reconcile with the results in the business at this outer loop scale, right? All these things have to be connected together. Ultimately, I'm not saying that if you leave today and you do not have a picture that's this complete, that you're missing or that you're going to be underperforming, but I do think that if I want to understand if I have the right system of measurement, I want to be considering all of these scales. So again, another way to look at this is putting those individual metrics in the context of their scope, and then being able to kind of connect the dots or zoom out and zoom in and understand that we have integrity in our system of measurement. Okay, so what's worked for me in this context? Again, I think it's really important to understand why we're measuring what we're measuring, to be able to answer that question, especially when it comes to technical leadership, because we have to be able to justify the things that we're tracking to people we need to report to. But for people who report to us, we have to be able to demonstrate that you are measuring this for a reason. We need you to be tracking things accurately, maintain data quality so that when it comes time for us to justify our performance or improve, we can quantify that easily. I think it's pretty common to measure things that we're not actually going to make a decision based on, you know, just to keep track of them, just to have a complete system of work. But if all of our measurements aren't connected to something that we're actually going to do differently, then we have a big problem. I think this lack of ownership over metrics is a big challenge also. So I like to see people step up and say, I will drive this forward, at least for a period of time. And ideally, make sure that the data quality is there, that it can be correctly attributed to what we expect, to understand the trajectory, the trend, the progress. I do think that data quality is really important. I work with a lot of teams that are just kind of YOLOing Jira, and then they wonder why they can't measure anything, or that when I come in and I'm looking for answers, that there's nothing I can really tell them because their data is garbage. Garbage in is garbage out a lot of the time. There's a lot we can do to clean up data now that we have AI tooling, but I do think that we have to take it seriously. We have to have behaviors that we can attribute to the reason why we close tickets on time, the reason why we label things the way we label them, the reason why we have specific sizing of tickets is that we want to create predictability. We want a system of work that tells us what to do based on data. And then I think that we should be making hypotheses. If we expect to achieve an outcome, we should have a sound hypothesis about how we expect that to happen, especially when you're dealing with a board and you've got to justify your decisions. And then obviously people know averages are not the greatest, but I think really engineering yourself into a position where you can speak about percentiles, whether it's 85, 90, whatever the appetite in the organization is. Your percentile in VC could be 37% confidence. But I think having a percentile is much better than looking at averages, looking at basic representations of data. And then the last one. The last one is a mystery. Do you guys have another one of these? Oh, wait a second. Okay. And then I think also segmentation of data is another hygiene thing, but understanding that not every incident is a 4-alarm fire. Measuring 4-alarm fires and cat rescues is valuable, but we shouldn't lump them all together, right? Okay, so I'm a big fan of looking at your system of work, mapping it out, adding data to be able to understand not only what we can tell people in terms of predictable expectations of when things will be done, when we'll actually get to where we want to go, but also understanding really the constitution of that work. What proportion of time are we waiting? This is very important with humans. It's also very important with agents, right? We can waste a lot of time churning, waiting, batching up work, piling work on people who are over capacity and just creating a lot of waste and delay. So I think it's very important to be able to have data and focus and say, we don't have to improve everything, but the data is telling us that this is really important to focus on. Okay, I will talk very, very quickly about tools. I think that there are certain things that we can measure that will give us much higher quality data in terms of leading metrics. So understanding that things that we're doing are working. Pro-Kanban's really good about this, taking a workflow and actually operationalizing it, creating a system of management. Minimum CD, how many people have heard of minimum CD? This is minimum continuous delivery for reference. Super useful resource, basically tells you the industry's best practice of how to get things done very effectively. Leading metrics, I've recently developed discovered Lighthouse, which I really, really like for team level performance, portfolio performance. DevLake is another thing that is really valuable for understanding throughput, portfolio performance, continuous delivery. Has a lot of integrations, also super open source. And then surveys for your qualitative data, right? Understand that as you're pulling in a specific direction, that it's not creating negative consequences in an area that you're not paying attention to. And then lagging, obviously we have spreadsheets. Metabase is a tool that I've used for a long time to kind of represent visual data and metrics. And then, as I mentioned, I'm a big fan of the value stream as a tool, as a representation of the SDLC, as a product development process, as projects, as new product development. You can throw it at any process and really get visibility very quickly. Okay, key takeaways before I run out of time. Work backwards. I can't express how important this is to me and how well it's really helped. Understanding the big picture of the entire system, and then working backwards to the detail at the granular level. Understanding that leading metrics are really what get us confidence on a daily basis that we are going to hit our targets or that we are headed in the right direction. And I think that there are often things that we don't measure or we don't measure clearly enough to like daily practice. I think it's very easy to start with value stream mapping. If you think that that's a dubious claim, reach out to me and I'll give you a bunch of resources on how to do it very quickly and very easily. And then I think that it's really important to understand our measurements first and then implement tooling afterwards, right? I'm a big fan of just getting in a spreadsheet and saying, what is a question we want to answer? Why do we need to have the answer to that question? What are we going to do with that answer? Who's going to own it? And how often are we going to report on that information, right? What format does that information need to be in? So if you're interested in an assessment like that, I have tooling for that. I'm happy to have a conversation. If you have a tough measurement challenge that you're trying to solve, or you're trying to figure out how do I connect what we're doing to what we're trying to achieve or what the board wants to see or my CEO wants to see, I'm happy to have a chat. I've been in this for a long time and looked at a lot of different companies. So I want to offer that to you. I'd be very happy to talk. And whether it's here or elsewhere, you can shoot me an email or grab a spot on my calendar. Thanks, everybody.